In this lecture, we are going to look at how we can insert a pivot table in Excel. We have already converted our source data into a table, and that's what we are going to use to refer in our pivot table. So, how do we insert a pivot table based out of our table? The answer is very straightforward. You need to go to Insert tab at the top and click on Pivot Table here. You have two options, pivot table and recommended pivot tables. Recommended pivot tables are basically tables, or I would say pivot tables, recommended by Excel with a set of predefined fields. So it tries to understand the data and hopefully comes up with an answer as to what the end user, that is you, needs to see in your pivot table. But that does a really poor job while coming up with answers. So we are not going to use recommended pivot tables, but just to give you an example as to what you would have, let's click on recommended pivot tables. And as you can see, here you have a set of predefined tables that you can use. Again, it does not really know what we want to analyze. It is just giving us some kind of suggestions. I personally do not use the recommended pivot tables because, as I mentioned, it does not do a good job recommending what we want most of the times. So I will click on cancel and get out of that box. And instead click on pivot tables here to insert a pivot table. We will be using the first option to always create a pivot table from scratch. So here we have create pivot table box, and the first question it will ask you is to select a table or a range from which you want to create a pivot table. Here, because I was already inside my table, it has selected the table that I am in, which is IMDb. In case you wanted to refer to something else, you could simply remove this and select the range reference. Your IMDb seems fine, so I'm keeping it the way it is. And moving on to the second important question, which is where do you want to insert the pivot table? You can insert it either on a new worksheet or even on the existing worksheet in a particular cell. I will personally go with new worksheet. You can try out the existing worksheet option as well. But I would like to keep my pivot tables on a separate worksheet to keep things neat and organized. So I will click on new worksheet and click on OK to insert a new worksheet and have a pivot table there based out of the IMDb table. Once I click on OK, you have a new worksheet called Sheet 2 available here, and here you have a blank pivot table. The first thing I will do is rename my worksheet. So you can either right click and click on rename or simply double click and rename it to, let's say, pivot table, and hit enter once your name is entered to fix it. Here we have the pivot table. This is how a blank pivot table looks like, and you have the text to build a report. Choose fields from the pivot table fields list. To your right hand side, you have pivot table fields list. This is what it is mentioning. So we need to use the pivot table fields list in order to create a pivot table from scratch. Remember, pivot tables are drag and drop tables. So we simply drag and drop items into these boxes in order to create a pivot table. In case you by mistake click on the close icon here and you do not have the pivot table fields list here, you can simply go to your pivot table. Inside the pivot table, go to any cell, right click on the cell and select the last option called show field list in order to enable it again. So I'll click on this and now it is back. This is how we can insert a pivot table in Excel. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one.